بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we left off speaking about the events of 1976, where a number of issues and problems arose between the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was the official representative of Palestine on the international stage. Big problems developed between the PLO and Syria. And that was because Syria entered into Lebanon and they took control of some of the Palestinian strongholds in Lebanon, and they disrupted the movement of Palestinian forces from Lebanon. So this caused problems between the PLO and the Syrian government. And now, with the Palestinians, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, facing problems with Syria, this is something that hindered their movement even more, because they already had problems with Jordan. Now they have problems with Syria. They already were in conflict with the different factions in Lebanon. They were heavily restricted within Egypt, and of course they had the opposition from within Palestine that they were facing as well. So from all angles, they were facing heavy pressure during this period of time. So the next year, in November of 1977, the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, he made a very shocking decision, and something that nobody expected. He decided to officially visit Israel, a state visit to Israel. And he was received in Israel by the Israelis with great respect and with great honor. Menachem Begin, who was the prime minister of Israel, he welcomed Anwar Sadat, and others from the evil Zionists of Israel welcomed him as well. So this is something that made the Palestinians very angry. They felt that this was a betrayal from the Egyptian president. And not only the Palestinians, but the Arabs in general were very opposed to Anwar Sadat officially visiting Israel as the president of Egypt. Because officially visiting Israel, this is basically a recognition of Israel. So the Arab countries, and especially the Palestinians, they felt that this was a great betrayal. So not only did he visit Israel, but he was invited to speak in the Israeli Knesset. That's like the Israeli Congress. He was asked to address the Israeli Knesset. And this is something that added to the anger and the disgust that the different Arabs around the area felt towards him for making this decision. So the Arab world basically condemned this official visit. After Anwar Sadat's visit to Israel, an agreement was reached on a peace process. But as we mentioned, there was severe backlash from the Arab world, and there was strong condemnation from all over the Arab world against this move made by Anwar Sadat. So they were very upset that he visited Israel, and they were very upset that he made an agreement with them to start a peace process. So in response to all of this, in March of 1978, Fatah, the Palestinian resistance group, they carried out an attack on Israel near Tel Aviv. And then Israel responded to this operation with an unprecedented armed attack, a very heavy armed attack. They invaded southern Lebanon. They destroyed dozens of villages within Lebanon, and they killed 700 Lebanese and Palestinians. That was the Israeli response to the Fatah attack near Tel Aviv in 1978. So after Israel invaded Lebanon and took all of these strongholds within Lebanon, they basically gained control over all of southern Lebanon. After gaining these strongholds in southern Lebanon, Israel handed 41 of these positions to international forces. They said, okay, we will not occupy this land ourselves. We will leave it to the UN and the international forces to keep these lands. But they kept one border strip. They kept one area on the border, and they did not hand over that portion to the United Nations. Instead, they handed over this portion to a renegade Lebanese army. Basically, a faction of the Lebanese army that split from the Lebanese army. And this faction was known as the South Lebanon Army. And they were against the actual official Lebanese army. So this South Lebanese army, the South Lebanon army known as the SLA, it was led by a man named Sa'ad Haddad. And he actually was loyal to Israel. So he originally was an officer in the Lebanese army. But then he formed this group from within the Lebanese army, and he broke off from them. So this offshoot was called the SLA, the South Lebanon Army. So they were against the actual official Lebanese army. And Sa'ad Haddad, he was loyal to Israel. He would do whatever they told him. Whatever they told him to do, he was ready to obey their commands. So that border strip that Israel decided to keep, they gave it under the command of Sa'ad Haddad and the SLA, the South Lebanon Army. All right, so now while these events were unfolding, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, he was engaged in further negotiations with Israel. And these negotiations were actually sponsored by the United States under the then president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. And these negotiations eventually led to the signing of the Camp David Accords. And I'm sure you've heard this before. The Camp David Accords. This was signed on September 17th, 1978. So America mediated this peace agreement between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, and the Camp David Accords were signed in the United States. So after this, Israel entered into a peace treaty with Egypt. And under the conditions of this treaty, Sinai was returned to Egypt. Remember, Israel had control of Sinai, the Sinai desert, and of Gaza. And previously, Gaza and the Sinai desert, they were under control of Egypt. But Israel took those two pieces from Egypt. They took the Sinai Peninsula and they took Gaza. So now under the terms of this agreement, the Camp David Accords, Sinai was returned back to Egypt. But Gaza was not returned. Sinai was returned, but Gaza was not returned. And the Arab world and the Islamic world in general were not happy with this agreement. They were not happy with this agreement. So the PLO, they were upset with Anwar Sadat for making this agreement with Menachem Begin. And because of this agreement, the PLO entered into a direct conflict with Egypt. Now, they were in conflict with Egypt, and other Arab countries also declared their objection to the Camp David Accords, and they actually announced a boycott of Egypt, and they expelled Egypt from the Arab League. This was a big decision. They expelled Egypt from the Arab League, and before, the Arab League was actually headquartered in Cairo. Egypt was a big part of the Arab League, and it was headquartered in Egypt itself, in Cairo. So now the other Arab countries, they decided to expel Egypt from the Arab League because of Anwar Sadat's agreement with Menachem Begin. They expelled Egypt from the Arab League, and they moved the headquarters of the Arab League from Egypt to Tunisia. They moved it to Tunisia. So you can see that the Arab ranks were very severely fragmented. And this, of course, resulted in more pressure on the Palestinians, and it really resulted in a collapse of Arab morale. All of these things going on, right? This is something that led to a collapse in Arab morale, and it also led to political chaos within the Arab world. Now, during this time, there were some new Islamic movements that were continuing to develop within Palestine itself. And around this period, a great figure emerged, Shaykh Ahmed Yasin, rahmatullahi alayh. And he established Al-Majma' Al-Islami in Gaza. And during this time, the Islamic University in Gaza was also established. And that became the most important Islamic stronghold in Palestine. Then the Islamic Jihad movement was founded by Dr. Fathi Shiqaqi and Abdul Aziz Aouda. They had studied in Egypt, and they were actually influenced by some of the ideas of Syed Qutb. And with this ideology, with these ideas, they came back to Palestine and they formed the Islamic Jihad movement. All right. Then in 1980, of course, the Iraq-Iran war started in 1980. The war between Iraq and Iran. And that lasted for 8 years. The Iraq-Iran war lasted for 8 years, until 1988. And this war, it was a big war. And it really drained the resources of the region. Not only from Iran and Iraq, but also from the Gulf states. Right? All of this led to a weakening of the Gulf states and in their open support for Palestine. Right? And oil prices also declined afterwards. And this further weakened Arab support for the Palestinian cause. Because the oil prices went low, this is something that affected the economy of the Arab countries. And because the economy of the Gulf countries was affected, that affected their support for the Palestinian cause. So Israel took advantage of all of these things that were going on in this period, and they intensified their attacks on the revolutionary strongholds in Palestine and also within Lebanon. So in 1991, Israel launched 80 ground and naval and aerial attacks on the Palestinian revolutionary strongholds within Lebanon. Then in 1981, on October 6th, 1981, October 6th was a day of celebration for Egypt. Because remember, October 6th is the day that the Egyptian army broke through the Bar-Lev line to get into the Sinai Peninsula a few years earlier, right? So they consider that a great military success. So October 6th became a day of celebration in Egypt. So during the October 6th celebration in 1981, the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat was assassinated by a member of his own military. Anwar Sadat was assassinated by a member of his own military, a man named Khalid al-Islambuli. Khalid al-Islambuli, he's the man who assassinated Anwar Sadat on October 6th, 1981. And he mentioned, when he was asked about it, he mentioned that his primary motivation, the reason why he did it, was because of Sadat's signing of the Camp David Accords with Menachem Begin. He considered that a great betrayal, and because of that, he assassinated Anwar Sadat. And of course, he was captured and he was executed for this crime. All right, also in 1981, the then Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Fahad ibn Abdul Aziz, who later on became the king of Saudi Arabia, and he is actually the one who built this masjid, rahmatullahi alayhi, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him. In 1981, he was Prince Fahad, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and he proposed a peace plan. He proposed a peace plan, and this peace plan was presented at the Arab League Summit in Morocco in November of 1981. So this was Prince Fahad, the Prince Fahad peace plan of 1981. And it was an 8-point plan. The first point of this peace plan was that Israel has to withdraw from all Arab territory that was occupied in 1967, including East Jerusalem. right? All of the new territory they gained in 1967, they have to withdraw from those lands. That was the first point. The second point was that any Israeli settlement that was built on Arab land after 1967 has to be dismantled. And this includes those settlements that were built in East Jerusalem. The third point was a guarantee of freedom of worship for all religions in the holy places. So any Jew, any Christian, any Muslim who wants to go to Jerusalem and pray, they have the freedom to do that. The fourth point was an affirmation of the right of the Palestinian people to return to their homes. Over all of the events of the years, so many Palestinians were expelled from their homes, or they were forced to flee from their homes. So one of the points of this plan was that every one of them who had to leave, they have a right to return to their homes. And for those who do not wish to return to their homes, they should be given compensation in lieu of that. The fifth point was that the West Bank, Al-Dhaffa Al-Gharbiyya, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip have to go under a transitional period under the supervision of the United Nations and then be transferred back to the Arabs. So for now, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip can go through a transitional period under the United Nations, but then eventually they should be returned to the Arabs. The sixth point was that an independent Palestinian state should be set up, and Jerusalem would be the capital of that Palestinian state. The seventh point was that all states in the region should be able to live with peace in the region, right? Everyone should be peaceful with each other, and no one should show any type of aggression over anyone else. And the eighth point of this 8-point plan was that the UN or the member states of the UN must guarantee the carrying out of these provisions. So the United Nations would be responsible to make sure that all of the points of this plan are actually implemented. So this was the plan of Prince Fahad ibn Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia. But of course, and you can guess that this plan was rejected by Israel. It was rejected by Menachem Begin. All right, in April of 1982, a Jewish Zionist extremist stormed the Dome of the Rock Masjid on Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa compound. There is the Dome of the Rock, right? That's the famous masjid that you see in all the pictures with the golden dome. So a Jewish extremist stormed into the Dome of the Rock in April of 1982 with a machine gun, and he opened fire, and he killed and he injured a number of Muslims. Now, when this man was captured, the police identified him, and they found out that his name was Alan Harry Goodman. Alan Harry Goodman. And he was 37 years old, and he had moved to Israel from Baltimore, Maryland in 1977. So this guy was from America. He moved to Israel, and he became radicalized as a Zionist in Israel. And he carried out this attack at the Dome of the Rock in 1982. When they searched his home, after they captured him and they searched his home, they found in his room some flyers, some papers, brochures from the CAC movement. Right? This was a small extremist group of ultra-nationalist Zionists led by a rabbi named Meir Kahane. And this group, they advocate the expulsion of all Arabs from Israel and the replacement of the mosques on the Masjid Al-Aqsa compound with a Jewish temple. They say that all of the masajid, Al-Masjid Al-Qibli, the Dome of the Rock, and the other masajid that are in that area, they should all be torn down and Jewish temple should be built in its place. This was their belief. All right. Around the same time period, Khalid al-Hassan, one of the representatives of the PLO, he proposed a peace plan calling for an international conference on the Palestinian issue. And even Fatah, which was known for its military resistance, they began to retreat and reconsider under Israeli pressure that, okay, maybe instead of military action, we can try to see if we can find a political solution to this issue. But this didn't last for long. And the revolutionary bases in southern Lebanon, the Palestinian revolutionaries who were still based in Lebanon, they launched missile attacks on Jewish villages in Al-Jalil. Right? So you can see the situation is intensifying once again. This situation continued to intensify when Fatah, members of Al-Fatah, they assassinated the Israeli ambassador in London on June 3rd, 1982. And this assassination, it was a big deal because Israel at that time, they considered themselves at the height of their power, and the Arabs were weak at that time. So for Israel to have its ambassador assassinated, this was a big blow to Israel. So Israel was under severe pressure with all of these events happening. And this led to the preparations for the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. So Israel decided to invade Lebanon in 1982. So the Israeli invasion of Lebanon began with a military occupation operation, and ground forces advanced into Lebanon from 2 points, from the coast and also from the mountains. And their main objective was to obliterate and destroy and eliminate all revolutionary movements that are based in Lebanon. All of the Palestinian revolution movements based in Lebanon, Israel wanted to destroy all of those movements, and they wanted to expel the PLO and their presence from Lebanon. The PLO had representatives in Lebanon, and even Yasser Arafat himself, he had an office in Beirut. So they wanted to expel the PLO completely from Lebanon. So on June 7th, Israel took control of the city of Sur, and as Israel invaded and stormed southern Lebanon, the PLO, they retreated to Beirut. And at this point, the Syrian army intervened, and they clashed with the Israeli army. And this confrontation also led to aerial fighting. And with the aerial fighting, with the Air Force of Syria and the Air Force of Israel fighting, Israeli air military superiority became very evident. That definitely the Israeli Air Force was much stronger than the Syrian Air Force. The Syrian Air Force, they used Russian planes. They had planes from Russia. Whereas the Israeli army, they had very advanced American aircrafts. America is the one who supplied Israel with their aircrafts. So the Israeli Air Force managed to destroy the Syrian Air Force. It really incapacitated the Syrian Air Force, and it destroyed the Syrian anti-aircraft missiles as well. The Israeli Air Force downed 100 Syrian planes. And it was very evident that the Israeli military had air superiority over the Syrian military. Also, Israel destroyed Syrian tanks, and this forced Syria to withdraw under severe pressure in the air and on the ground. So Syria suffered a lot. They suffered, massive losses in personnel and also in equipment. So southern Lebanon, after all of this, southern Lebanon fell into Israeli hands very easily. Israel took over southern Lebanon, and the resistance continued as much as possible through Palestinian and Lebanese efforts, but the Israeli military superiority began to crush this resistance until the Israeli forces actually reached Beirut, and they besieged Beirut. So they surrounded Beirut, but they didn't want to enter the city. They didn't want to actually go inside Beirut, because when you enter into the city, especially urban cities, then the guerrilla warfare begins, right? And the Israeli army was scared of this, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the Jews, لا يقاتلونكم جميعا إلا في قرى محصنة أو من وراء جدر. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about these people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here he's mentioning the cowardice of the Jews. That they don't want to face fighters one on one in combat. They'll fight you from behind walls, or they'll fight you, behind fortified fortresses where they have a lot of protection. Then they'll fight you. But if they have to face fighters one on one, that's something that they are not willing to do, right? So that was back in those days. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about the Jews of that time, Banu Nadir, right? But the Jews of modern times are exactly the same. لا يقاتلونكم جميعا إلا في قرى محصنة أو من وراء جدر. Right? So they didn't want to enter Beirut. They surrounded the city, but they didn't want to enter Beirut because they were afraid to actually enter Beirut. So this siege of Beirut, it lasted for a number of months, and they were bombing Beirut during this siege, but they were not entering inside the city. But they were bombing the city, and this led to the destruction of the infrastructure of Lebanon. And it also led to a rift within the Palestinian people, because the PLO and Al-Fatah before, they were working together, right? But now the PLO and Al-Fatah, they split due to what was going on in Lebanon. Of course, whenever there are defeats, this always leads to fractures. If there are groups that are working together, but then they are defeated, it leads to them splitting apart, right? This is what always happens, right? So the PLO and Al-Fatah, they started to split from one another because of what was going on in Lebanon. Now, during this time period, the Arab states, they had another conference in Morocco, and they proposed another peace settlement. And this time, the peace settlement included a provision to recognize Israel's right to the territories that it occupied in 1948. They were ready to officially recognize that the land that Israel got in 1948, that is Israel, and they have the right to that land. The Arab states were ready to accept this. Now the PLO, they were besieged in Beirut at this time. The PLO, they're in Beirut. Yasser Arafat himself was in Beirut. And they see what's going on. And they see that the Arabs are willing to negotiate for peace. And the PLO decided, okay, we will agree to this settlement as well. The PLO decided to agree to this settlement. So negotiations then began to extract the PLO from Beirut. And during this time period, Yasser Arafat himself, he was in his office in Beirut. And finally, under this intense pressure and under this heavy bombardment, an agreement was made. And Yasser Arafat himself, he announced on July 25th the acceptance of all United Nations resolutions related to Palestine. Whatever the United Nations has proposed in terms of these peace settlements, we are ready to accept these provisions, and we will no longer continue to take any militant action. And Yasser Arafat declared from this point that the PLO would now shift towards political work, and they were ready to abandon armed struggle. They were ready to abandon militant action, and they were ready to focus solely on political solutions to their problems. So this was the announcement that was made by Yasser Arafat, the head of the PLO, on July 25th, 1982. So inshallah we'll stop there for today, bi'idhnillah, and inshallah next week we'll continue with more of the history of the Holy Land, bi'idhnillah. Jazakumullahu khayra, wa barakallahu feekum, wallahu alam, sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers. Can you please remove your cars from the garage because I'm closing the garage. I'm closing the garage, please. Can you remove your cars? Thank you.